Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 48 of the AskHistorians podcast. So today we have a very special episode, you might say. It was not originally intended to be so, but our episode on Canadian history and identity just happened to fall conveniently, you might say, right a few days after the Canadian elections. So while far too late to swing anyone into a patriotic fervor to go vote, hopefully at least you were not burned out on all things Canada, particularly those of you who live in Canada, because that would be rather unfortunate, actually, since you're in Canada. But for those of you not burned down on all things Canadian, we're going to be talking about the great white neighbor to America, the little country which just happens to be the second largest nation by landmass, the place where bear rugs are still growling. Our guest today is going to take us through a whirlwind tour of Canadian history, starting basically from when the English first moved in around the 7 Years' War, taking us all the way up into Trudeau's Canada, not the current Trudeau, the Trudeau pair, not Phil's. And along the way, we're going to be kind of comparing, contrasting how this kind of joint identity of both English and French have kind of shaped the nation of Canada, and really looking at the way that a singular, independent novel, you might even say, a new identity was formed out of the particular circumstances in the formation of the nation of Canada. So I hope you enjoy it. But just to note that at almost an hour and a half long, this is one of our longer episodes. I was tempted to split it into two, but I figured I'd keep it together because it was kind of on the edge there. Let me know in the discussion post whether you wanted to prefer to have it episodes about this length into a single episode or two. So let me know that. But anyway, enough rambling. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. So today I'm here talking to the Canadian historian, as he is known on the Ask Historians community. However, he probably goes by different names, so why don't we go ahead and let him introduce himself and let him know what exactly it is that we're going to be talking about today and what got him interested in it.
My name is Jeff Keelan. I study Canadian history, as my Reddit username suggests. And generally, I focus on Canada and the First World War, and specifically French Canadians and a nationalist named Henri Bourassa, who is one of the probably the most evocative and passionate voices rejecting the First World War in Canada. I've been studying Canadian history probably technically since I started university, which was more than 10 years ago now, and it's been a bit of a haphazard ride. I've kind of just fallen into topics that I've started studying, specifically French Canada, and there's no great narrative or push that or interesting story that got me involved, really.
The spirit of Canada did not come upon you in the night and move you?
Yeah, I've always been very pleased that I managed to get the name Canadian Historian, though. That was a big triumph for my career, I think.
Well, I mean, it's like signing up, probably the first person who signed up for Twitter is, Jeff.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So, when we talk about Canada, I think, I'm an American. I know most of our listening audience and the audience on the subreddit is Canadian, not Canadian. It'd be great if it was an entire 400,000 people were all Canadian. It'd be very strange. But, most of our audience is American, and I think we kind of take Canada, our neighbor to the north, as a bit for granted. So, but it does have its own, unique and kind of complicated history. So, particularly with the fact that it is not simply an English colony originally, but it's also a French colonies originally as well. So, when do we first kind of see like this union of, or however peaceful or unpeaceful it may have been, when do we see this melding of the French and British colonies into a single political entity?
Oh, and into a single political entity doesn't happen.
Or at least, when does that process start? I guess you could say.
I would say it starts probably with the conquest of New France, which is generally, southern Ontario and southern Quebec was all controlled by the French before the 7 Years' War, which I think Americans call the French and Indian War.
That is correct, yes.
And some Europeans might call it the Third Silesian War, but we call it the 7 Years' War here in Canada. And the British were determined to conquer France, North America, because they thought that this is where they could win the battle for the colonies. And so they conquered North America through a pretty epic battle over Quebec, the city of Quebec, where there's two famous generals, at least famous to Canadians, called General Wolfe and General Montcalm, I guess.
I don't speak French, so I anticipate me mangling French entirely through this. I apologize in advance.
I study French a lot, obviously, and I constantly mangle it. It's a source of embarrassment, but what can you do? And so there's the British managed to essentially outmaneuver the French in North America and annex this colony. And the French, in the Treaty of Paris that ends the 7 Years' War, basically don't care about New France. As far as they're concerned, it's just a bunch of forest and snow. The French author Voltaire famously calls New France quelques pans de neige, which is just a couple of acres of snow. There's nothing there. And they choose to hold on to other more valuable colonies and just let essentially Britain take over North America. And it's at this point when the British realize that suddenly they have a problem, because they now have this large population of French speakers and Catholics who are now under their administrative control, and they've never really had to deal with a problem like this before. They've had to deal with small numbers of French Canadians and small numbers of Catholics, and have came up with various solutions, most of them terrible. But now they have to kind of integrate this population into what is quickly becoming the British Empire, the one that the sun never sets upon.
Well, I have an interesting question about just kind of more of a demographic question, which may be interesting to some, not to others. But what exactly was the kind of population breakdown of the Canadian territories, or whatever Britain was calling it at the time? How much? What was the percentage that was Anglo? What was the percentage that was Franco at the time? How significant was this sudden influx of Francophones?
Oh, it was almost entirely French at this point.
Okay.
There was almost no settlement in Ontario, other than little French forts for the fur trade, and there was some settlement out east in the Atlantic provinces, but otherwise it was mostly entirely French at the time of the conquest, which was in 1759. And so the British have the American colonies to the south, which was a large population, but they were very much separated from the French Canadians who were along the shores of the St. Lawrence to the north.
Mm-hmm. So how did the British start to, what was their policy towards this new French population in their borders?
Well, they changed tactics, because there was another instance where they had annexed a population of French speakers who we call the Acadians, and they essentially exiled them, essentially took them from their homes, pushed them out, and they dispersed across the world. A lot ended up in Louisiana, but they essentially decided that we just don't want any of these people in our borders. But they couldn't do that this time. So this time they, luckily for the French speakers, decided on a policy of moderation. And they quickly pass something called the Quebec Act in the 1770s, which essentially guaranteed rights to these French Canadian Catholics within the British Empire. It allowed them to continue using their own legal system. It preserved Catholicism, preserved their territorial rights to what New France had been when it was conquered, and some other things, and essentially said that you French Canadians, you're allowed to exist, you're allowed to do what you want, as long as we can govern you and we make money off you, effectively. But everything else is good to go. And this actually is listed as one of the causes for the American Revolution, because the Americans who were involved in this French-Indian War had been fighting against the French, fighting against their Aboriginal allies, and saw that the British had basically said, okay, everything's fine. We're not going to give any of your territory to these American colonies to the south. We're not going to punish you in any way. You're essentially going back to the life you lived, except now there's an English king in charge instead of a French king.
Yeah, so the what would become the United States, those colonies down there were hoping for kind of a payoff at the end.
Yeah, and just added to all the other true causes of the American Revolution, which I can't really go into detail about, but I'm sure
a whole other podcast.
Yeah. So they just saw it as one other way that Britain, or rather England, was mistreating them and not giving them what was their due. But this is likely part of the reason why French Canadians didn't even join the American Revolution, even though they were invited to by the rebels, because they, as far as they're concerned, they had a pretty good life. I mean, they lost the elite upper crust of colonial society, so lawyers and administrators, and all they had left were sort of, I don't want to call them lower classes, but essentially farmers, traders, maybe what people could call middle class, and then the religious elites, so like priests and bishops who still maintained a presence in the colony. So it radically changed the makeup of French society, but not in a bad way, not in a way that they were angry about by any means. So they decide to stay loyal to Britain when the revolution breaks out to the south.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the term for the British, rule over the United States colonies, the colonies that became the United States, is usually kind of seen as benign neglect, which came to a head because people didn't want to pay taxes, I guess you could say. But it seems like the benign neglect was working out just fine up north.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a contentious issue even today for historians, because English Canadians would say that this is a turning point, that this is the first step in a long history of kind of accommodating policies towards French Canada by their English overseers, or eventually by English Canada when the nation forms. But French Canadians, particularly those who want Quebec to separate from Canada, say that this history is actually the first step in sort of, one, English domination of French Canadians, but also that this policy of kind of letting things stay the way they were stunted Quebec growth, that the society couldn't evolve or progress to the way other societies were evolving and progressing over the next centuries. And it would only be until, realistically, we could say all the way up to 1960 is when Quebec sort of stays in this very religious focused society that's very much embedded in this older historic idea of being culture, let's say, that is frozen from 1759 onwards. At least that's what they argue.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, part of that argument would be that since, as you mentioned, like, the top level political and kind of economic elites were no longer Francophones, so no longer French. And instead, they've been replaced by this glossing over layer of British. It sounds like, of course, with the religious differences, that you still had maintaining this kind of more elite class of religious individuals, priests and such like that. So that can mean, I could see at least where that argument's coming from, of saying, well, it's this near theocracy ruled by the priests, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they do a lot to preserve their power as well. I mean, they're not exactly innocent sitting on the sidelines. The church in Quebec is very concerned throughout the 19th century, and from conquest into the 19th century, in saying that we are the ones who get to teach young French Canadians. We're the ones who get to control the health system. We're the ones with influence, and they support those who continue supporting their power in Quebec, and sort of push those who don't want it off the sidelines.
Moving forward a little bit, with the breakaway of the 13 colonies that would become the United States, I assume you probably saw a lot more influx of British colonists going into, I guess, friendlier Canadian territory, and therefore, trying to transforming that area less into this kind of like solid Francophone bloc into the more kind of mixed area that we now associate it with.
Yeah, I mean, that's marks the arrival of the Loyalists, which that's something familiar to Americans, right? Loyalists and the fleeing up to Canada.
We call them traitors.
Oh, right, of course. But it's actually one of the foundational myths of English Canada is this idea of these men and women, these families that stayed loyal to Britain, coming up north and then being given land throughout present-day Canada and saying, okay, you're going to essentially create a second British North America that's going to be better than those rebels to the south, the Americans that have formed their own nation.
Yeah, and of course also starting off the long tradition of people in America saying they're going to run away to Canada.
Yeah, if that George Washington becomes president, I'm going to leave this country. That's what they're saying. And that's when we see the first expansion of English Canadian or English speaking populations in present day Ontario, which is sort of north of the Great Lakes, around the Great Lakes area. And that's when we start to see the beginning of a real, I guess, equality, or at least conflict between French and English Canadians as they try to figure out how do they coexist within this colonial framework in this second British North America.
Yeah, so you have this English-speaking Ontario and French-speaking Quebec, kind of these two large blocks that are forming.
Yeah, and then you have the Maritimes, which is largely English-speaking with, little pockets of French speakers in there, but they're kind of off to the east, and they don't influence what is now Ontario and Quebec as much. They're really the ones grappling and dealing with the War of 1812, dealing with the rise of democratic government in these colonies. And they're the ones who are generally considered the sort of pre-Confederation Canadian history, although a lot of Maritimers were probably going to hate me if they listen to this.
Well, let's gloss over these very difficult things. And what kind of was the government of the time in this Canadian area? And when do we start to see something that we would call the formation of the zygote of this independent Canadian state, which of course does not come later, but when do we see some place that we start to call Canada?
Probably 1791 is the first time we could point to something, because that's when they create Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada being Ontario because it's up the St. Lawrence, Lower Canada being Quebec because it's down the St. Lawrence, even though on a map they're in the reverse position of what their names would suggest. And they make this constitution that sort of defines colonial governance. And the real question facing these Canadians, facing French Canadians and the British is, how can they create a set of colonies in North America that won't fall to the exact same thing that happened to the Americans? That's the big question that they're struggling with, is how can we avoid another revolution? Because it did not end well for the British, as we all know. And they really wanted to create a stable government that allowed the British to control the colonies, but didn't force the people to revolt, essentially. And that's the question that kind of is causing a lot of problems throughout the early 19th century. The War of 1812 happens, and so the American invasion kind of pushes people away from American ideas, but they're still kind of filtering through this idea of republicanism, this idea of democracy. And in Canada, what really arises in prominence is this term called responsible government, which is essentially the idea that the leader of the colony, who we would call prime minister, is responsible to the people, that he can be elected or unelected, and it's not being controlled by the governor general, which would have been sort of the British figure in charge of the colony as far as the British were concerned.
So we did have, these provinces at this point of Upper and Lower Canada were not being governed directly from England at the time, or did they have their own kind of like local parliaments?
Yeah, they had governor generals who were, they used to be military commanders, but slowly turned into more civilian authorities that were appointed by the King or Queen of England. And originally they would create a cabinet that would advise them in government. And that cabinet was usually formed of whoever they wanted. They would just pick and choose, and it was undemocratic. And so Canadians, both English and French Canadians, began pushing for this idea of responsible government and saying that, well, this cabinet of advisors can't be whoever you want. It has to be drawn from a group of elected individuals from the colonial legislatures. You can't just ignore what the people want and go off and create whatever laws you want, or take away whatever laws you want. And there's a series of rebellions in 1837, 1838, which we call rebellions because they weren't successful, but they're essentially an echo of the American Revolution, in that they're demanding that the voice of the people be heard. And even though these rebellions failed, the British realized that they have to avoid the problems that had happened 2 generations earlier in America. They can't just rule with a fist and by virtue of the monarchy. They have to enable some democratic reforms, and it's over the next 10 years, that's when we see the rise of this responsible government and essentially the establishment of a Canadian democracy.
And so when we're saying responsible government, what it's really meaning is that Canadians responsible for their own government, people in what would become Canada responsible for their own government as opposed to someone else being responsible for it in a way.
Yeah, and also that the government is responsible to the people.
Mm-hmm.
So that it has to, if the people vote them out of office, then it's a new government coming in place, which seems very obvious and evident to us.
But
for
at the
them,
time, it was literally revolutionary.
Yeah, exactly.
So when do we really see kind of the full spread of responsible government throughout this region then?
It takes until 1848 where they actually agree to have democratic government. By this time, they've merged the two colonies of Upper and Lower Canada. They've now become Canada East and Canada West, but they're actually they're controlled by one central government. And so for the first time, you have French and English Canadians who are operating in legislatures. You have politicians who have to talk to each other, and they have to make agreements between them. It's not just, in the French colony, they're doing this, in the English colony, they're doing that. In this united Canada, they actually have to start forming political alliances and start considering what policy might be good for French Canadians and English Canadians, or, and make the sort of political deals that make a democracy work one way or the other, sort of compromises and discussions that kind of help people form policy that's hopefully for the better good.
Yeah, so, I would assume at this point, there was probably, we mostly think about Canada today as having a kind of a dual identity of both French and English. But, was there movements at the time, even back then, for the French speakers to kind of gain further autonomy from the British Crown?
Not particularly, because, I guess we could talk about those rebellions in 1837-38. Those were sort of seeking autonomy from British control, but their failure meant that the more radical and liberal side of the Quebec political spectrum is muted, essentially for a century afterwards. And as I said earlier, the church, which was so powerful within the colony, clamps down on these liberal views and sort of nurtures a more conservative idea of French Canada, a conservative idea of Quebec that has its place within the British Empire, within the British colonial system. And it's a place that the church wants them to accept, because obviously the sort of radical revolutionary ideas coming out of America, and especially the secular France, which had already gone through its, it had torn down the church in the French revolutions. The church in Quebec was very fearful of that and sort of tried to keep everyone passive towards British rule as much as possible.
So there was kind of a self-selection in this period after the spread of responsible government, kind of a self-selection towards people who are willing to kind of work together within this system to kind of keep it together.
Yeah, because they didn't want revolution, right? They didn't want Canadians are stereotypically very calm people and very small c conservative. So, and by and large, through decisions like this, where they said, well, listen, we don't need British soldiers going through the streets. We don't need some George Washington up here. Let's just accept British rule and work within that system as best we can.
Yeah, so let's move ahead to Confederation then, because that is the big watershed moment. So tell us a little bit about what leads up to Confederation, and of course, for those people who are not familiar with Canada Day, shame on you. Tell us what Confederation is.
So you have this united Canadian province, which is English and French trying to work together in one government. But this begins to break down, and eventually two sides, there's sort of the conservatives and the liberal reformers. So sort of left wing and right wing, as we would understand it today. And they get enough support for both sides that Parliament and government becomes a deadlock. Neither side can gain enough power to have effective policy and effective control over the government. There's just a series of elections, a series of coalitions that always fall apart. And it's essentially, they realize that they need to change something. So the solution that's suggested by a conservative politician named John A. Macdonald is to create a confederation of all the Canadian colonies in the second British North America. So that includes Ontario, Quebec, and they also go talk to the maritime provinces, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and they talk to Prince Edward Island, but they aren't really enamored with the deal at first. So Confederation, which is the creation of a federation of Canadian colonies, which are now called provinces, is essentially just the official creation of a government that is above the colonial or provincial level, if that makes sense. A federal government, I guess, is what we would call it.
You said that that Macdonald was the one kind of leading the charge here. Were there some people who were in that Prince Edward Island? Their government was somewhat cold, you might say. Of course, you would expect that Prince Edward Island would be somewhere cold anyway. But who were the main oppositions here, or was it kind of this more consensus movement towards, okay, this has to be done?
There was opposition in the province of Nova Scotia, where a man named Howe, and I can't remember his first name right now, which is too bad, a man named Howe organized resistance to Confederation in Nova Scotia and also more largely in the maritime provinces. But the story is that all of the Canadian representatives, so people from Ontario and Quebec were the only Canadians at that point, they take this long boat cruise up the St. Lawrence out towards the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and they meet in Charlottetown, which is in Prince Edward Island, the capital of Prince Edward Island. And there they have this kind of long meeting with these maritime representatives and discuss why Confederation would be good. And they're saying, come on, join this larger entity. It'll help us against the Americans who are going through the Civil War at that point. So they seem very dangerous. It'll be better. We'll build a railroad out east, and we'll get trade and economy moving again, because the age of sail has sort of been on the decline by the 1860s. So the economy out east is hurting, and they make all these promises. And most importantly, they get everyone extremely liquored up. They just get incredibly drunk, and they're literally partying on this houseboat off the coast of Charlottetown. And eventually they managed to get them to accept to the terms of Confederation, more or less as they wanted. But the story is that they were drunk, or at least mostly drunk, while debating this. And and John A. Macdonald himself is a very famous alcoholic. He was drunk in House of Commons often, and so a lot of early Canadian history revolves around alcohol, strangely enough.
Perhaps not so strangely. The Constitutional Convention in the United States, of course, is famous for its bar tab. It sounds like at this point the Canadians have, or at least what is now becoming the Canadians and extending this out to the maritime provinces as well, have kind of come to the idea of a federal government. Now, to keep reflecting back with the United States, we had the abortive attempt with our Articles of Confederation, and then we had the Constitution. And there was the discussion of, adding the Bill of Rights. So was there and also kind of the discussion over what representation would look like. So were there similar debates going on in Canada?
I don't think so. I'm not 100% clear on whether there was a debate to create an official constitution in that sense. Mm-hmm. I know we eventually end up with the British North America Act, which becomes our constitution in a sense, but that's under the British system of common law. That's actually just legislation which was embedded in which had to be approved by Britain and kind of is separate from Canada. Like Canada couldn't really edit it easily, so it's constitutional in a sense, but not in the same way as a Bill of Rights, or we later have to create a constitution called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but that doesn't come along until 1982. Yeah, they're pretty much happy with the British system, like the common law, and then they essentially said the precedent will guide us in terms of defining what is right or what is wrong for Canadians.
Yeah, so they set up, I guess, kind of a trans-provincial or an all-provincial inclusive parliament at that point. But I guess I want to just circle back down to, how did they determine delegation to this parliament then?
Well, in the British North America Act, they wanted to make sure that provinces were represented well, but not overrepresented. I mean, you don't want the very tiny province of PEI to have too many members of parliament in the legislature. So they decided to go by representation by population, with the caveat that certain provinces would be given a minimum amount, especially in the Senate, which was not elected.
Yeah, actually, I that's kind of what I was steering this towards, because I personally find the Canadian Senate to be a little confusing given the American system. But just briefly, what is the Canadian Senate?
The Canadian Senate is the upper house of our government structure, and Canadian senators are appointed by the Governor General, but on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. And they can be, at this point, they could be anyone. Anyone could be appointed to Senate. But it was originally proposed that way, essentially because the Canadian politicians at the time wanted to maintain some control over the House of Commons. So in case that the House of Commons suddenly elected a bunch of radicals, who the commoners were electing, they wanted to have the ability to say, well, these in the Senate, only, basically only rich white people are there, and they'll guard our interests. So it's very much an elitist approach to saying, the Senate will be filled with these appointees who will only represent, the rich upper class or upper middle class of the sort of landed people who were supposed to be making all the decisions in their mind.
Well, let's keep moving forward in time, and so we formed the Dominion of Canada at this point. In 1867, I believe, is the official date of Confederation.
Yes.
Yeah. So, how does this go forward through the late 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century then?
So Confederation happens in 67. And there's all these sorts of promises with Confederation that, it's going to improve all of the lives of everyone in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces. And what immediately starts to happen is that things kind of fall apart. They bring in British Columbia after a couple of years, which is on the west coast, north of Washington State. And they say, we're going to build a railroad out to you as well. And they start building these railroads, and they bankrupt the Maritime provinces. So none of what they were promised in the 1860s comes to pass. They say, we're going to build all these railroads for you, but you have to pay for it, because you're part of this Canadian nation now, and they can't
also
afford
we're
it.
building them out to British Columbia.
Yeah, well, then that's what the Ottawa, which is the nation's capital in Ontario, that's what they want to do. They want to push it out west because that's where all the money is, and they also want to sort of lay claim to this vast continent because they're afraid that the Americans are just going to come up and take whatever they want, which they could because they have a much larger military than us.
Yeah, and the post-Civil War era saw huge expansion of America into the Western area as well.
Yeah, and so they're very much aware of this, but as they expand westward, building this railroad, which takes decades to build. There's a whole sort of problems with various Indigenous people in Canada where they suddenly realize they can't just let them, they have to claim the land for
Shockingly,
Canada.
People live here.
Yes. And then there's also a lot of Métis, which is people of European and Aboriginal descent. And then just French colonists who survived because, the French fur trade, which existed before the conquest and was still being used by the British, long after 1759, was made up of a series of forts spread across the continent. And there were French hunters, French traders, French people, and then French families just living in these places, expanding their population. And so by the time the Canadian government decides that they want to go west, they have to deal with all these different populations. And one in particular causes a lot of problems in Manitoba, which is a province west of Ontario. And there's a guy there named Louis Riel who essentially raises the Métis and French and Indigenous population of the area in revolt against these incoming English-Canadian threat, let's say. And they successfully create the province of Manitoba out of nothing, out of just, blank space on the map, and force the government to accede to their demands and, give them proper responsible government like everybody else has, because the government simply doesn't have the capacity to send military soldiers out there. But
So they reach a compromise.
I don't think the Canadian government was called a compromise. They were kind of forced into it because it would have taken, months and months to send soldiers all the way out to Manitoba without railroad access. there because those hadn't been built yet.
Yeah, and because Canada, as many people know, is somewhat large.
Yes, very large. But the Red River Uprising, as it's called, which forms and creates the province of Manitoba and it enters into Confederation with these other provinces, sort of reminds the French Canadians who are focused in Quebec that there's other French Canadians in this new country that they're a part of. They suddenly remember that outside of the borders of their province, there's all these pockets of French Canadians who are living and trying to deal with the same problems they are, which is essentially surviving under English rule. And it begins this movement in Quebec, or encourages this movement among French Canadians, rather, this idea of survivance, or survival. And suddenly, among French Canadians who are surrounded by English Canadians and Protestants, they realize that it's very important that they preserve this core element of who they are, which is Catholicism, their religion, French, their language, and their French Canadian culture, which has developed over the last couple of centuries. And this really defines the opening decades of the Canadian nation, is this sort of dispute or this conflict between French and English Canadians, where the French Canadians are just trying to survive, trying to preserve themselves against assimilation, and the English Canadians are trying to, on the one hand, deal with these, what they would probably consider troublesome French Canadians and, compromise with them. But at the same time, some of them just want to get rid of them entirely. So some of them are just trying to assimilate them either through the short way or the long way. And that defines Canadian politics for all of our history.
When you say the short way, what do you mean by that?
Some English Canadians wanted all French Canadians outside of the province of Quebec to be assimilated. So they would have no French language instruction for their kids. They would have no separate Catholic schooling. And they would either become English speaking and not Catholic, ideally, or they would move back to Quebec, which was, in quotation marks, where they belong. And as they spread westward, and as we create new provinces across the Midwest and across the prairies, they're constantly dealing with the problem of what they're going to do with these little pockets of French-speaking Canadians.
So we have this kind of policy of kind of survival among the Francophones, and some very different ideas about how to deal with that with the Anglophones. And during this entire time, the boundaries of Canada or the political boundaries are racing westward. But moving forward, I think kind of this all kind of comes to a head in World War I would assume, which is kind of seen as a very watershed moment for Canada.
Absolutely. I mean, the first French-Canadian Prime Minister was a guy named Wilfrid Laurier. He was elected in 1896 and is elected out of office in 1911. And he kind of helps bring things together. But in 1911, a conservative prime minister, an English Canadian named Robert Borden, comes into power. And now by this point, the divide between the left and right has almost become about a very different vision of the country itself. So on the right, the conservatives are generally, obviously I deal with a lot of generalizations in this sort of discussion, are generally imperialists. They want Canada to be tied closer to the British Empire, which is arguably at its height in 1914. They want Canada to do whatever it can to help the British Empire, because as far as they're concerned, Canada's future prosperity lies with the success of the British Empire and further integration with that empire.
So they're seeing themselves really as part of the British Empire.
Yeah, absolutely. There's even imperialists in Canada who believe that one day, decades in the future, Canada will be the center of the British Empire, because England is simply too small. There's not enough resources, not enough people, and Canada will become this sort of glorious ascending nation that will, draw in all the threads of the British Empire to it, because it's sort of they think it's a natural progression, especially given how America had developed to the south, starting from these small colonies, developing to this large, expansive, populous nation. They think the same thing's going to happen in Canada in the 20th century. And that they'll be the jewel of the British Empire, and they'll get rid of that, India off in Asia. It'll all be about Canada. And so they do they commit themselves to a series of things, including fighting the First World War, that will improve that vision. Now, on the other side, you have the left wing, the liberals, And they can't ignore these imperialist ideas because so many English Canadians do believe in them, and so many have a very strong sense of Britannic cultural heritage. But they tended to be more nationalist. They tended to understand Canada, although it wasn't autonomous in the early 20th century, they hoped it one day would be. And there were various figures trying in different ways to push Canada away from the British Empire, some by a more slow route, others more quickly. These nationalists tended to be French Canadian as well, because they didn't want to be subsumed in this British culture that English Canadians and the imperialists seem to be trumpeting. And this all comes to a head in the First World War when, the first general European war in 100 years breaks out. Suddenly Canadians are forced to decide what they want their country to do. Do they want to support Britain? Do they want to go fight in this European war that they don't have much stake in? And by and large, at least in 1914, by and large, a lot of them agree. Even the French Canadians, even the most dedicated nationalist, who's the man I study, Henri Bourassa, he too decides to support the war. That's just how amazing, how significant and momentous it seemed to them at the time. But over the next 4 years, that compromise, that agreement would just break apart completely, just completely shatter.
Yeah, so what is it that kind of, I can see the appeal of this war kind of bringing people together, because that's usually what we associate with war and conflict, is that people say, let's put aside our differences for now and take care of this. But, what is it that breaks it down afterwards? Is it kind of, I guess you could say, that the hangover effect? They wake up after armistice and say that, okay, turns out our problems haven't gone away?
Well, for French Canadians specifically, it's the issue of conscription that really sours them on the war, because they don't want to go fight for Britain. They've been in North America for 300 years by this point. They have families, they have farms, they have no particular connection to France or to Britain or to Europe. They don't really care who wins that war. So they don't want to go fight. But then Canada enacts conscription in 1917 and 1918. And for French Canadians, this is beyond the pale, because what it represents is that within this democratic government, if the English Canadian majority wants to pass laws that the French Canadians don't agree with, they can do it, because they can vote in more members of parliament into the House of Commons, and they can pass legislation like conscription that is the majority of French Canadians are vehemently opposed to.
Because they might see it as being conscripted to go basically fight for a foreign nation that they have no connection to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that seems to break all of the promises of Confederation that were largely implicit, mind you. It wasn't explicitly stated in the British North America Act or in the discussions that there would be equality between these French and English peoples. And this, it's sort of the climax of the decades after Confederation, where they're constantly being confronted with the fact that they are not equals in Confederation, that they're not being treated the way they thought they were going to be treated. And conscription is sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, when they realize, why do we even care about what's happening here? Why do we keep trying to reach our hand out across to these English Canadians who will just do whatever they want during wartime? And that's when we see for the first time the rise of Quebec nationalism over this sort of pan-Canadian nationalism which had existed previously.
Now, does this have to do with this Henri Bourassa that you had been referring to earlier?
Yeah, Henri Bourassa.
Oh, yeah. So, it sounds like he was kind of pivotal and a bit of the linchpin here. So, what were his views first on World War I and then on kind of forming this kind of unique political bloc in Quebec?
He had been probably the most ardent nationalist within Quebec and within Canada itself, arguably. And he had spent the decade and a half before the war arguing fiercely against imperialism and against sort of British influence over Canadian policy, constantly reminding Canadians that what interest does Canada have in South Africa during the Boer War? What interest does Canada have in the naval race between Britain and Germany? Canadian national interests have nothing to do with that. let's just ignore it and concentrate on our own thing. And when war breaks out, he's actually in Germany itself. He's right on the border in Alsace-Lorraine because he's doing research on minorities, as you know, which makes sense. And so he's visiting all these Alsatians who are this French-speaking minority under German rule in literally 2 days before war breaks out. So July 30th, he arrives and there's nothing he can do. And they all tell him in this little village he arrives that they're like, war is coming. You have to get out of here because you're Canadian. You're in Germany. This isn't going to work out well for you. So he gets on this train and goes from Alsace, goes up to Belgium, crosses the Belgium border on foot because all the trains are now being used for troop transports because the war is, a day away. He leaves all his luggage behind and then comes into Paris, where he sees this sort of almost religious experience, because what he is witnessing is the formation of the Union Sacrée, the sacred union, where all these elements of French society comes together to defend against the evil German menace. And Bourassa sees this and says, this is what I want for my country. He wants English and French to come together and form this one people, even in wartime, even in defense against enemy. That's what he's been striving for his entire life. So he makes it back to Canada. In the first months of the war, he's actually pretty positive about the Canadian involvement, because he thinks that this is the moment. This could be Canada's own sacred union. But almost from the beginning, English Canadians reject what he's saying entirely. Because he says, well, let's not go all out here, guys. Let's have a limited contribution because, we're a small country. What can we do? But the rest of Canada is saying, let's give them every piece of cheese we have. Let's give them billions of dollars. Every soldier, come on, just send them across the Atlantic. And because Bourassa doesn't agree to that extreme amount of support, they vilify him. And literally are saying we should hang this guy just because he's expressing slightly different views. And after 2 years of that, Bourassa finally just throws up his hands and says, you know what, I'm done. I'm out. I can't support this war anymore. And that's in the beginning of 1916. And then as it gets into conscription, he too is caught up in this revelation that the English-Canadian majority will do whatever it wants during war because they have more power within the democratic system. And it breaks Bourassa in a sense, is what I argue, is that he suddenly realizes that the vision of Canada that he's had for most of his career, and certainly in 1914, can never come to pass. In fact, that will never happen.
It puts a lie to this idea of two co-equal and co-mingling and coexisting people. It says, well, the majority will always rule, and the French Canadians, will always be the minority, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of Bourassa himself actually steps away from politics after the war, but a lot of other politically engaged French Canadians, specifically Quebecois at this point, decide that the solution isn't to create a Canadian nationalism in opposition to imperialism, but to create a Quebec nationalism, which is ironic because after the wars, when English Canadians suddenly realized that imperialism is kind of bunk, because, they went off and died for no reason, so they start forming their own nationalism, which we would call Canadian nationalism.
So it's interesting that, World War I has this kind of transformative effect in the fact that basically both moieties within Canada, the Anglo and the Franco kind of groups, they both had very different experiences and very different motivations for this, but they eventually came out on kind of the same side of being like, okay, well, we need to at least move ourselves away from this kind of British imperial system, it seems like.
Yeah, it's interesting because the war is known as a national moment for Canada. There's a very famous battle called the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where Canada apocryphally fought for the first time as one cohesive unit. It was all Canadians. They took this ridge where the French and British had failed, and they were this bright spot in a larger failed campaign in April 1917. And we say that's where the Canadian nation was born, on the slopes of Vimy Ridge. So even as the war causes this English-Canadian nationalism to emerge, it's the exact same events, but from a different perspective. From the perspective of Quebecois at home, it's the same events of the war that English Canadians are saying, well, look, this proves that there's a nation of Canadians here that deserves to be protected and defended. The Quebecois are saying, well, look, this proves there's a nation of French Canadians here because we're being persecuted. We need to defend ourselves. And I've argued before that it's the same events, but it's simply different perspectives that give rise to these two competing nationalisms within Canada, which still exists to this day.
Well, I want to ask how that kind of plays out and leads into, well, not really directly leads into, but how it plays out in the interwar period. So, I mean, how exactly does this kind of two different views, two different experiences of the same event proceed forward in kind of building kind of Canadian identity or Canadian identities, it would sound like, in the interwar period?
So among English Canadians, they realized that being part of the British Empire isn't all that it's made out to be. So they began to retreat from sort of British influence. And it's in 1931 that the Westminster Act is passed, which finally gives Canada full control over its foreign policy. So for the first time, Canada is actually able to choose what treaties it will sign, and more importantly, choose whether it's going to go to war, which it had not technically been given the option in 1914. So English Canadians are sort of developing this separate Canadian identity, still tied to the British cultural heritage, mind you, but they are beginning to understand what it means to be an autonomous nation and to be a separate people. They're no longer simply well, they are still British subjects, actually, but they begin to think of themselves as Canadians and begin to think of Canadian interests before British ones.
Yeah, they are Canadian subjects of the British Crown, I guess. It would be kind of one way to thread that needle of talking about it.
Yeah, they don't actually become Canadian citizens until like 1949. So, but they begin to think of themselves differently. There's a sort of a national consciousness that develops among English Canadians. And so it's a strange, compared to most nations coming out of the First World War, Canadians are very positive about it, or at least very solemn about it. They understand the sacrifices they made, but those sacrifices were worth it because now they have this Canadian nation that exists and is thriving up until the Great Depression, at least.
Yeah.
Whereas,
I was going to actually move ahead to this because, like, it's one thing to kind of come out in this kind of afterglow of saying, like, well, we went in there, we did something, we learned something from it, and then it's another thing to do that while you're, starving. So how does the Great Depression sweep across Canada, and kind of how does that affect this idea of this kind of solid Canada then?
It has a pretty terrible impact because, I mean, Canada, one of the main economic engines of Canada is wheat, is, crops and farmers. And the Great Depression causes the price of wheat to just fall to terribly low levels. And you have the Dust Bowl, which extends up into Saskatchewan and our prairies, just like it did in the United States. And so there are people who have a very, very hard time. I mean, I assume it's as bad as it was in the United States. You have people who can't pay for housing. You have work camps where young men who have nothing else to do go out and essentially start working in lumber yards out in the middle of nowhere in Northern Ontario because that's the only job they have available to them. And it causes a crisis in Canada, but particularly in terms of who gets to control the Canadian economy. Is it the provinces or is it the federal government? And because of the severity of the situation, the federal government essentially steps in and starts having a more direct control over the economy in order to help these provinces which are worst hit by the Great Depression. But it changes the balance of power towards Ottawa, towards the central Canadian government. And this has a curious impact on Quebec because Quebec, as I said, has this sort of this nationalist sentiment rising. And now Quebec can point to Ottawa and say, oh, look what those English Canadians are doing. They're taking away power that was given to us as a provincial government. And this becomes another common theme in Canadian history where the Quebec government can sort of use Ottawa as a boogeyman, even though these are policies which are necessary given the crisis that's occurring in the 1930s. It becomes a sort of point of action for these nationalists or the varying, for any provincial government in Quebec.
In the sense that any increase in the federal power would, even though it may apply to all the provinces, Quebec can look at it and say like, oh, here they go, taking more power away from us, in particular, because there is that added level of the cultural clash as well, as in addition to just kind of this debate over, local versus federal government.
Yeah, and there's a long-serving premier during this time named Maurice Duplessis, who is pretty much, I don't think you can call him fascist. That's very extreme, but like
it's a very loaded term, yeah.
But authoritarian, let's say. He controls Quebec with an iron hand, essentially from 1935, I think, the 1930s up to the late 1950s, with a brief interruption. But it's strange because American businessmen are coming to Quebec and making tons and tons of money off Quebec resources. But at the same time, the Quebec government points to Ottawa and says those English Canadians are the ones you have to be afraid of, whereas the Americans are kind of allowed to come and go as they please because they're not involved in the cultural conflict that's occurring, that's in the background of all these sorts of developments.
So, we see this increasing of the Ottawa government, the federal government, the centralized, national government power kind of extending over Canada. But then, of course, as many people will know, the Great Depression had a somewhat eclipsed by something that we call World War II. So, what was the Canadian role in this? Because at this point, you mentioned they had a choice whether or not to, join this war or not join this war.
It's interesting because some people point to, I think it's September 8th, maybe September 9th, which is when Canada joins the Second World War, which is a week and a couple of days after Britain joins, which I think is September 1st. And people point to this and say, well, look, Canada waited. Canada was able to declare war on its own, and that's a sign of our independence. But the reality is that Canada was going to join the war on the side of Britain. There was no other options there. The wait was somewhat symbolic, but it was also somewhat a matter for our prime minister, who at this point is a man named Mackenzie King. Well, William Lyon Mackenzie King. Everybody calls him Mackenzie King. And he was probably one of our wiliest and most shrewd politicians in Canadian history. And he wants Parliament to declare war, because the Canadian Parliament to officially declare war rather than simply saying on September 1st, we're going to war, because that gives him plausible deniability. He can say, look, all of you voted for this war. So if anything goes wrong, because he remembers the First World War and how divisive it was, he can say, look, all of you said yes to this. We're all in this together. And he's very much using it for political points, let's say. But that being said, it's also a much clearer war in terms of who's right and who's wrong. Nazi Germany had far more problems.
It's not fighting an imperial war at this point.
Yes. So it's a much clearer justification. And Canada actually has a very large role in the war, all things considered, especially considering its size. And Mackenzie King, strangely, has a part to play in that, even though he doesn't want Canada to be too involved at all. He wants to stay out of it because, as far as he's concerned, the only thing war means is that his Liberal Party is going to be blamed for things he can't control, which means he'll get elected out of office.
So he's a politician through and through, essentially what you're saying.
Yes, and he was a bit crazy too. He was extremely intelligent and would make all these decisions that ensured the Liberal Party was in power for decades, but he also talked to dead people and talked to his aunt and his dead dog using seances. He was a bit crazy.
It makes you miss the days back when Canadian politicians were just drunk.
Yeah, and I'm guessing if he had social media, probably would have been not elected.
You mentioned, of course, that Canada had a kind of a notable role in World War II. Particularly, I think most people know that they had their own section in the invasion of Normandy that they did quite well in. But do we see kind of a repeat of the same Anglo-Franco split there, where this I don't want to say the Bloc Québécois because I don't know if that exists yet, but the Quebec side says, like, look, we're fine fighting this war and we think it's okay, but we don't really want to if you want to go fight it, we won't stand in your way. But don't, is there another issue of conscription or is that as well?
It's essentially a repeat of the First World War, but this time Mackenzie King learned his lesson and sees all of this coming. So he says, first he declares that there will be no conscription. He says that conscription will not happen in Canada because he wants French Canadians to vote for the Liberal Party. But by midway through the war, he begins to realize that conscription might need to happen, that Canadian losses are high enough that he might need to enact conscription. So he declares that he's going to have a referendum on conscription, where he essentially argues famously that they will have conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription, which is sort of a Weasley way of getting out of it. And of course, he knows how the referendum is going to go. English Canada votes for allowing the government to break its promise not to have conscription. It's not even a referendum on conscription. It's simply a referendum on whether the government could one day enact conscription. And the English Canadians vote yes, French Canadians vote no, but Mackenzie King says, well, we're not going to have conscription right now, but one day, I just want you to know that I have a mandate to do so.
So basically the referendum was really to say, hypothetically, you know how we said there wouldn't be conscription? Hypothetically, would it be okay if we did?
Yes, exactly.
Very wily politician, yes.
And then by late 1944, when the Canadians are involved in some of the most terrible fighting that they get involved in during the war in the Netherlands, they have extremely high casualties because they're trying to clear the Channel ports, or not the Channel ports, but rather the islands that form up the Netherlands, and they're all essentially these entrenched German fortifications. So they have very high casualties, and the top Canadian generals come back to Mackenzie King and say, look, we need more soldiers. We're going to run out of soldiers, and this war isn't won yet. Operation Market Garden has failed, so it looks like this is going to go into 1945. So that's when Mackenzie King comes back to the Canadian people and says, okay, you know what? We now have conscription. And you all told me that I could have conscription, so now it's going to happen. But because he does this sort of Weasley path, and I'm missing a whole bunch of other things that happen, but because he does this, Canada avoids the sort of divisions that conscription caused in the First World War, and specifically, French Canadians keep voting Liberal, which is what Mackenzie King is the only thing he cares about.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it sounds like he put enough twists and turns in there so that when conscription finally came down, he could say, like, look, I didn't want this, but it's necessary, and we all know it's necessary, and it's not really me doing this. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, and he it's almost up into the very end. It takes him until November 44 where he finally says, okay, we'll have conscription. He keeps trying to get out of it. He keeps trying to find other ways to avoid it because he's so afraid of what it will mean for French Canadians. And meanwhile, they have developed their own opposition to conscription. At this point, there's a political group that forms, and it's called the Bloc Populaire. And it's, again, it's another sort of group of French Canadians opposed to conscription, unhappy with English Canadian dominance and interference in their province. And they try to begin a political movement against conscription with some success, but it doesn't have the same resonance as political movements in the First World War had, which ultimately ended up with riots and people dodging the draft and a lot more problems in the First World War than end up happening in the Second World War, largely because Mackenzie King is so agile and hard to put a target on.
Coming out of World War II, of course, there is the Cold War that comes along, but also it seems like Canada is moving even further into being kind of like many kind of dominions within the British Empire is moving more towards independence at this point, but also kind of having to deal with this Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I would guess particularly since, a lot of the missiles will be flying over Canada. So, I mean, how did Canada deal with the changed world after World War II?
Well, the Canadians, for several decades, had kind of been growing closer and closer with the Americans. And their experience fighting the Second World War right beside British troops once again sours them towards the British. They realize that it's impossible to work with those kind of uppity English upper class generals like Bernard Montgomery. They don't like working with the British, but the Americans are very friendly. Roosevelt and Mackenzie King are particularly close while Roosevelt is still alive. And they come up with all sorts of agreements during the war that are bolster the Canadian-American economies and kind of draw the nations closer together in the sort of traditional relationship that most people understand between Canada and the United States today. And by the end of the war, they're just sick of the British. The British are, losing their empire. It seems to the Canadians that they often throw away Canadian lives just to save the lives of British soldiers. And so they want nothing to do with them, and they're very kind of grateful to enter into the American embrace.
So if World War I was kind of seen as this, to oversimplify it, seen as kind of the birth of a Canadian identity in a way, then World War II is kind of the birth of this Canadian-American fellowship, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it certainly begins
Our
sort of North American focus rather than European, let's say. I don't know, love affair might be it's too saucy for Canadian history. And you're right that during the Cold War, I mean, what choice do we have? Like, we're either with the American superpower or the Russian superpower, and it's clear who we ought to choose.
Yeah, so, I mean, did Canada get involved in any of these kind of Cold War adventurism in the military sense?
I don't think in the sense you're talking about in terms of, like, the wars across the world in this Cold War. I mean, we were involved in the Korean War, but I think what most people don't realize is that we were also heavily involved in the missile war, because we created a line of radars up in the Canadian North called the DEW line, which is essentially how we defended North America against the possibility of Russian attacks. It was those radars that would have seen the bombers, seen the missiles, or mostly the bombers, I think. The missiles probably would move too fast, but it was that line of defense that protected.
At least give you enough time to say, hey, something's coming before it arrives.
Yeah, and some people say the Cold War actually started in Canada. In 1945, a Russian cipher clerk left the Russian embassy in Ottawa and defected to Canada and brought over all these Soviet secrets, because at that point the Soviets were seen as these sort of allies that had helped defeat the Nazis. They weren't that bad. But this cipher clerk, whose name was Igor Gozenko, defects to Canada, and there's a long story, and Mackenzie King actually wanted to just ignore him and hope that he hung himself, because Mackenzie King didn't want to be involved in this potentially politically damaging dispute. But luckily we accept him, we bring him on side, and he reveals that there's a huge Russian spy ring in Canada, which has been giving the Russians all these nuclear secrets, because uranium had been mined in Ontario for the creation of nuclear bombs. So there was some knowledge of nuclear weapons in Canada. And this had been passed to the Soviet Union through the spy ring. And that's when people suddenly realized that, the Soviet Union is not our allies. They're just another enemy waiting in the wings. And that kind of changes and helps start the Cold War as we know it.
Kind of want to jump a little further ahead here, because I want to move from the Cold War, which is, I mean, I believe it could probably be its own. It's a very large tangent, I guess what I'm saying. But I want to move in, kind of keep a focus on Canada and Canadian identity, because I want to move ahead to the 60s, because that was a very tumultuous time in Canada at that point, particularly in Quebec.
Yeah, so in Quebec in 1960. That begins what we call the Quiet Revolution, or the Révolution Tranquille, because the Quebec premier I talked about earlier, Maurice Duplessis, the sort of authoritarian guy, he dies in 59, and that leaves this huge power vacuum in Quebec, which is filled by the provincial liberals who say, you know what, now is time for change. They argue that Quebec is backwards, that the church has too much power, that it needs to modernize, it needs to catch up with not only the rest of Canada, but with the rest of the world. And we need to create this new Quebec society. And it's revolutionary, and it essentially is the turning point for the sort of history that we began with, where the church kind of takes over New France after the conquest. This is when they finally say no more. Things are going to change. And I've heard anecdotes about this time where I know someone who was teaching in Quebec in the 1960s, and he says that he was teaching at a school, and one year it was all priests and nuns and all very religious, and everybody was, acting, wearing proper clothing and everything. And then he came back the next year, and everybody was a hippie, everybody was smoking pot, everybody had long hair. I'm sure it wasn't this dramatic, but it was very quick, this change. And it seemed like, looking back on it now, it seems as if Quebec was almost bursting at the seams with this desire for change.
So was this something that kind of been held back by the kind of the dominance of this, not of this authoritarian kind of upper echelons of government that were, but then when, essentially was this a dam breaking, or was this something that was more pushed from the top down?
That's I think it's both.
And somewhere out there, a history student just got a dissertation topic.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because originally people would have said top down, but more recent works tend to point towards a grassroots movement. That even among Catholics, even among devout Catholics, there was a liberal movement within the Catholic youth movement in Quebec, and they wanted change as well, but it got away from them. They wanted change, but they didn't want to eliminate the church's role in society. They didn't want to make Quebec into a secular society. They simply wanted to liberalize the role of the church in Quebec. But after they kind of started this deluge, they couldn't control it anymore. So it's kind of a combination of both, but I think neither side was really able to say where it would go or what consequence it would have. And the interesting thing is, among Quebec historians, they actually disagree on who held them back. Why was Quebec backwards? And one side says that it was Quebec themselves, Quebecois themselves. It was the religious elite. It was the business elite. It was they themselves wanted to hold Quebec back. And then another side says it was the English Canadians, which obviously has much harsher implications for the relationship between English and French Canadians.
Yeah. Now, what's going on in the rest of Canada at this time as well? I mean, is there also kind of sweeping social changes as well, or is it more kind of proceeding along a little less, revolutionary, I guess you could say?
Well, I think in the 1960s we can talk about, and there's a title of a famous book called "The Demise of British Canada," and so you still have these English Canadians who feel connection to Britain because they've grown up. Maybe they fought in the Second World War under the British flag or the First World War, depending on how old they are. But English Canada is changing, and it's in the 1960s when we see the rise of Canadians young Canadians who think about Canada first. They don't feel any connection whatsoever to the British Empire or the United Kingdom because they're likely having been born immediately before or after the Second World War. So they don't really remember this British Canada that once existed. And they're looking for new symbols of national identity that is important to them. So they look towards things like Canada's role in peacekeeping, which we helped pioneer in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. They look to a new Canadian flag, which is introduced in 1966-67. They look they look at the centenary of Canadian Confederation, which happens in 1967, and they sort of draw on these new ideas and new symbols to create a modern Canadian identity that is not rooted in our colonial past.
So really what we're seeing here in the 60s is really kind of the formation of what most people would think of when they think about Quebec, or not Quebec, well, I guess about when they think about Quebec, but about Canada today.
Yes and no, because what happens is you have all this stuff happening in the 60s, and then in 1968, you have a new prime minister named Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is probably one of the most pivotal figures in Canadian history in the last 50 years. And I would argue that today we're living in Trudeau's Canada, for better or for worse, because he did some good things and some bad things, depending on what area of the country you're talking to. But he really recreates Canadian identity. And I could probably give you an entire podcast just about him. But he takes these elements of English Canadian identity and well, okay, let me back up here. There is a problem in Canada in the 1960s. You have the Quebec neo-nationalists who are separatists. They want to move out of Canada entirely. There's even a terrorist campaign operated by one group, putting bombs all over the province, trying to protest English Canadian and American dominance. And then in English Canada, you have this Canadian identity forming, while at the same time trying to figure out what to do with all these Quebecois who are not happy and with Canada. And this is called the French-Canadian problem, in quotation marks. And some of the solutions offered are like bilingualism, biculturalism, trying to make it so every Canadian speaks French and English, trying to make it so that the government always has to be able to provide services in French and English. But these aren't really sticking. And when Trudeau was elected in 1968, he rejects both of these two sides. He rejects the nationalism of English Canada and the nationalism of French Canada and says, you know what, we need something new. And he comes up with the idea of multiculturalism. Well, he doesn't come up with it, but he introduces it. And he says, you know what, let's abandon these national frameworks. This is not helping anyone. Nationalism has only been a source of evil. Let's come up with new ideas for Canada. And he brings in multiculturalism, and he also brings in bilingualism. But strangely enough, and unfortunately for Trudeau, what happens is that English Canadians simply co-opt these new ideas and say, well, now this is our Canadian identity. And they become new nationalist symbols in and of themselves.
Yeah, yay, the new multicultural Canada, which resembles quite suspiciously the old English Canada.
Yeah, especially in the early years. And today, I think if you talk to a Canadian and ask them if multiculturalism is a Canadian value, they're going to say yes. But just doing so places it in with this nationalist framework that Trudeau was trying to get rid of entirely because he saw how many problems it caused. And, maybe that failure is why we still have problems between the French and English today.
Yeah, and how was this official drive towards multiculturalism and bilingualism, how was that received by this growing Quebec nationalists?
Well, some accepted it, and the separatists, who were, the most ardent of the Quebec nationalists, rejected it entirely. They saw it, perhaps rightfully so, as just another means of assimilation and another means of trying to incorporate them into a larger Canadian community that they wanted no part of because, it had betrayed them time and again at this point. They'd constantly been persecuted on large scale and minor scale since the conquest of 1759, they would argue. And maybe as a result of this is when Quebec separatism becomes a powerful and influential force. In 1976, Quebec elects a separatist government, which is called the Parti Québécois, under a man named René Lévesque. And the entire purpose of this government is for Quebec to separate from Confederation. That is their stated purpose. And they also happen to have a lot of progressive social policies and fairly, left-wing outlooks, which is appealing to this new Quebec that's formed after the Quiet Revolution. But their entire purpose as government is to break up the government, in a sense. And that they almost succeed. In 1980, they have a referendum on whether Quebec ought to stay in Confederation or not. And they lose by a very small percentage, largely because Trudeau and the federal government launched this massive campaign trying to convince Quebecois to stay in the province, or stay in the country, rather.
Yeah, so what were the arguments on either side here? Because, this is a major kind of, I guess you'd call it a national constitutional crisis. Constitutional crisis might not be the best term there, but, it's kind of a national crisis. I mean, what were people, what were the arguments put forth pro Quebec sovereignty, and what were the arguments put forth kind of pro keeping Canada together?
Well, the sovereigntists, let's just call them sovereigntists. They argued that Quebec had nothing to gain from being within Confederation, that they had been persecuted historically, that anything that was important to Quebec was within its own borders. So the resources, hydroelectricity, money coming in from lumber and other, minerals up north. Why did they need the rest of Canada, who is just effectively draining their money? But mostly it came down simply to the fact that they argued that they were not like the rest of Canada. So since they were so different, they deserved their own nation, and Canada could be its own nation and Quebec could be its own nation, but you couldn't have two peoples existing within the bosom or the chest of one nation, let's say. Whereas on the other side, it wasn't even English Canadians. I mean, don't get me wrong, clearly more than 50% of Quebecois supported Quebec staying in the country. So it's not quite clear divisions by any means. But on the other side, they argued, one, that Quebec had signed up with Confederation in 1867. You can't just go back on that. They argued that it would be a terrible economic blow if they left, and that their economy would go into a tailspin. And there's probably some finer arguments within that one about debt and, whether or not the new country of Quebec could actually survive in a global market. In most importantly for their side, however, was simply that they were Canadians, that French Canadians and Quebecois were Canadians as much as Ontarians or British Columbians or Albertans or whatever province you want to point to, and that their rightful place was within the Confederation of Canadian provinces. And if the referendum had succeeded, it would have been a constitutional crisis, because even today, nobody knows what would have happened. Nobody understands how a country separates from another.
The referendum, of course, failed. Quebec is still part of Canada, but it didn't necessarily end the question of this. And there was another referendum in 95, I believe.
Yeah.
But I, without moving too much into kind of modern politics, we're kind of moving into the modern era here. So how would, moving forward from this referendum in 1980, we kind of move into kind of the more modern era, kind of moving into this something that most people are familiar with. It's generations of people are familiar with this time period. It's their lifetime. It's no longer becoming history. So, how is Canadian identity kind of continue to evolve from that early 80s and that crisis at that point?
I think the Canadian identity has been marked by this embracing of multiculturalism by and large, embracing peacekeeping and Canadian participation in United Nations missions, probably also marked by the rise of regionalism. One of the consequences of this English-Canadian divide was that other provinces began to argue that Quebec was being given special treatment, that Quebec is not, why do we focus so much on Quebec when Alberta, which has a large, has a big oil industry and makes a lot of money for Canada, says, who cares about these French Canadians? Who cares about these Quebecois? Why don't you talk about us? We're the ones making money for all of you guys. And the same with the maritime provinces and British Columbians and, Manitobans and Saskatchewan. They all began to coalesce strongly in some places, less strongly in others, around a sort of provincial identity, which we would call a regional identity, in response to this very strong Quebec identity, which, was firmly positioned on the shores of the St. Lawrence. And I'd say, I don't know, the last 30 years, I guess I said earlier that we're living in Trudeau's Canada, because of the decisions he made when he was in government in the 1970s, his defense of Canada against the separatists, the sovereigntists, and also he brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedom, which is when we finally get a constitutional Bill of Rights, I guess Americans would call it, and have these sort of rights entrenched in our legal system in a way that the government can no longer mess with. And Canadians have, by and large, embraced that charter and what it represents to Canada. And we consider it the final step in sort of our journey from colony to nation, because it's called repatriation, which I'm pretty sure is a made-up word, but it's describing taking our constitution, which was British law, and bringing it home to Canada and saying that now only Canadians are in charge of what's right and what's wrong, and only Canadians have these list of rights that are in the charter.
Well, Jeff, I think it kind of brings us towards an end there. I mean, unless you have some final concluding thoughts you want to leave with us.
I think it's interesting to talk about how history has developed in Canada, because we've talked a lot about this French-English divide, and the historiography of Canada has reflected this almost exactly, largely because of the language barrier. So English Canadian historians don't read French, and French Canadian historians probably could read English but choose not to. And so you have these two separate histories of Canada in French and English, one largely focused on Quebec for obvious reasons, and the other telling the story of a Canadian nation that has Quebec in it, but it's kind of the English Canadian view of Quebec, whether that's good or bad. And both of these histories develop as sort of national histories within Canada, and they coexist with each other. They're not quite in opposition because they don't really have many points of connection between them. But I think that's interesting for historians to think about, because it doesn't happen very often. Most national histories are pretty firm and, overpowering. But in Canada, these two coexist, seemingly not caring that the other is talking about the same events in a very different way.
Well,
that's all.
Thank you for leaving us that seemingly intractable problem. I want to thank you for speaking with us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
And as always, thank you all for listening. It is your participation in this as both passively, just kind of listening to it, and also actively coming into the discussion posts and following up with your very insightful follow-up questions and comments about how the podcast goes and runs, and suggestions on how to make it better. It is really heartwarming to get all that feedback and see the listenership numbers continually going up. So thank you all for listening, and thank our wonderful guest as well. Jeff was a terrific interviewee, and one thing that struck me listening back to this was just how much that Canadians and Americans don't really know about each other's kind of nation's histories past, or the history of their nation's past. It's an awkward phrasing there, but generally the idea that there were a couple times where Jeff points out that I don't really know much about the American constitutional governmental formation process there. And I, of course, was completely clueless before I really started doing my background research for this episode about a lot of things, Canadian particularly, and kind of the political history of Canada. So it's one of those things that's just kind of fascinating that these two nations can be right next to each other and really kind of see each other as not so different, but at the same time have this very distinct on each path, this very distinct political and cultural history behind them that is almost kind of unknown unless you've been kind of immersed in it as a citizen of that nation. So it's interesting to see that. I mean, we really are two nations separated by a common largest undefended land border in the entire world. But coming up next fortnight, we will be going down to the America's neighbor to the south. That's actually kind of weird, and I didn't plan that out like that. But we will be going to West Mexico. We will be talking to Mictlantecutli about the West Mexican shaft tomb culture. So we're going to be mixing a little bit of archaeology into our history here. So I hope you'll enjoy that. And then I have actually a two-parter episode that's going to be coming up after that about Zimbabwe, looking at it from the early colonial period and a little bit of the pre-colonial period, almost all the way up until the modern day. So mark your calendars for that and call your grandmother, tell her to listen as well. That one on Zimbabwe is actually going to be a two-parter because it is a fairly long episode. My guest was terrifically patient, and I was terrifically happy to have him speaking. So that one will be a two-parter, but again, go ahead and come into the discussion post and let me know if when we have these episodes that run to about an hour and a half. I do try to keep the episodes about 45 minutes to a little over an hour, but when we do run over, comment to the discussion post and let me know if you'd prefer to see this as a two-parter or just kind of kept all together as we did today. Until then, please go rate and review us on iTunes. That improves visibility, and so next time you want to have a long, in-depth conversation about Canada's political and cultural history, you'll have people who are equally as knowledgeable as you are now. And feel free to rate us and review us on any other service you happen to be streaming us on. We are on SoundCloud. The last couple of episodes are up on that. And you can always find us on our Libsyn page, it's our Mage page, and all the past episode discussion posts are on the AskHistorians subreddit. So come by and visit us there. Until then, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.